whoever. Wherever there was a voluntary association of professionals, Diocletian would come in, co-opt it, make it compulsory, and then make it hereditary. This process was amongst the most gradual of his career, but by the time Diocletian abdicated, most of the empire's citizens were attached to some sort of imperially mandated guild that compelled them to keep the job they had been doing. And it further compelled their sons to join the guild, and then their sons to join the guild after that. So, if by some random chance you were a tanner in the late 3rd century, that meant that your family was now, forever, tanners. Same for potters and teachers and fishermen. And of course, same for farmers. On top of everything else, you weren't even allowed to move anymore without permission, even if you planned to keep the same job, because Diocletian didn't want industries to die off in a given city due to unplanned population migrations. If you think this sounds an awful lot like the beginnings of medieval serfdom, then gold star for you. We are, right now, transitioning away from the Roman Empire of old and into pre-feudal society. Diocletian was the author of a lot of what defines the next 1,000 years of history. He did it as a response to the particular economic necessities of his day, but once it all took root, it really took root. One thing he did that most definitely did not take root is the last thing I want to talk about today. The infamous Edict on Maximum Prices, which represented Diocletian's last furious attempt to put a stop to inflationary prices. I don't want to spend too much time on it because, well, it was more or less abandoned an hour and a half after it was issued, but still, it is a fascinating little piece of history that deserves some attention, for no other of beer, Pannonian, Celtic, and Egyptian, and that the Egyptian kind was considered half as good as the other two, because apparently Egyptian beer was the Schlitz of the ancient world. After 16 years on the throne, inflation continued to ravage the empire, and nothing Diocletian did seemed to even slow it down. Though his tax structure had been mostly taken off the gold, silver, copper standard, there was no getting away from currency completely, and it drove Diocletian crazy that he could never ensure that wages kept up with prices, especially when it came to his soldiers. Paid to risk their lives in defense of the empire, Diocletian was outraged every time he heard of a soldier being forced to drop a whole year's pay on a single shirt. Price gouging and war profiteering was nothing new, but things had gotten ridiculous, and Diocletian decided that the main culprits were the evil, no-good merchants who were taking advantage of the situation. They were thieving the life savings of good, honest, hard-working soldiers, and it had to stop. In 301, Diocletian had finally had enough, and he issued in typical Diocletianic fashion an encyclopedic edict, divided into 32 sections, breaking down practically every single thing that could be bought and sold, and then setting a maximum price for it. The emperor was careful to note that he was not setting the price, he was only setting the maximum price. If you wanted to charge less, that was your prerogative. Just don't charge more. If you charged more, the edict was crystal clear in the consequences of your greed. Death. Of course, even with the death penalty hanging over their heads, no one paid any attention to the edict. No one had any motivation to turn anyone in for violating it, and everyone paid the going rate for everything, just as usually happens when draconian price controls are put into effect. But nonetheless, the edict was carved in stone and posted all over the empire, so we get to learn fascinating things about what an idealized version of Roman economic values looks like. Per-day farm laborers made 25 denarii a day, compared to the 50 earned by a stonemason or a cabinet maker. There were 7 kinds of wine, all listed at 30 denarii each, and one listed as simply ordinary wine, which sold for just 16. Aged wine actually lowered the price, as each of the 7 more expensive varieties dropped to 24 denarii once it was a year old. A lawyer could make 1,000 denarii for pleading a case, and 250 just for filing the opening paperwork. Our old friend Publius the mule driver would have made with maintenance 25 denarii per day, or 4 denarii per mile for 1 mule load of goods. Every kind of grain, seed, or bean you can think of gets its due price, as does every kind of shoe, boot, sandal, and shirt imaginable. Famously, the most expensive item listed is 1 pound of purple dyed silk, which a merchant was not allowed to charge more than 150,000 denarii for. And since the only person who was probably buying purple dyed silk by the pound was the emperor himself, I wager to guess that it was maybe one of the few items that actually went for the price listed. As I said, the edict was quietly abandoned just a few years after it was issued, and many historians believe that Maximian and Constantius never even got around to announcing it because they recognized what a terribly unenforceable idea it was. But for a while there, wherever Diocletian went, so went the price edict, until even he began to recognize that he was tilting at windmills. That was right around the time he decided to retire. Not that the two are in any way connected. With that, I'll bring to a close our brief little tour through Diocletian's reforms. We've seen the deep impact This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I see that there is another Julius Caesar biography available, this one by Samuel Willard Crompton. So if you still can't get enough of everyone's favorite dictator, well, now's your chance to get even more. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 127, Commanding the Economy. When Diocletian first came into office, the Roman economy was pretty much just limping along. In the critical agricultural sector, the combination of war, plague, and forced migration had left Rome with fewer people, harvesting fewer crops from fewer functional farms. In the less critical but still important urban centers, the hardships of the past 50 years had essentially brought construction, trade, skilled craft, and banking to a standstill. But as with everything else, Diocletian was optimistic about the future. He had big fancy plans for the economy, and turning it into what he wanted to turn everything into, a rational, centrally controlled mechanism that, once organized properly, would begin producing wealth for everyone in quantities not seen in years. Yes, the problem of inflation would put a kink in his plans, but Diocletian was determined to see the Roman economy reinvented, and by the time he abdicated, economic activity in the empire had taken on an almost wholly different character from what it had been before. Part of the change was the result of the natural evolutionary forces of civilization, but much of it was the result of the reforms Diocletian himself initiated. Just to give you an idea of where we're going, I want to talk today about 4 things: the attempt to stabilize the currency, the reorganization of the tax structure, the calcification of professions, and finally, the edict on prices, which, though it achieved basically nothing, is a fascinating bit of history nonetheless. So, yeah, it has finally happened. Years of misguided imperial fiscal policy have finally ruined the currency of the Roman Empire. By the 280s AD, prices had begun to soar, wages had become inadequate, and savings were wiped out. It was bound to happen. As I mentioned before, the sheer volume of base metal coins flooding out into circulation would eventually cause major problems for the empire, and it was during the reign of Diocletian that those chickens finally came home to roost. Which was a particularly maddening state of affairs for the senior Augustus, because in almost every other respect, the empire was recovering from its brush with death. But when it came to the money, not only was the wound not healing, it had only just begun to bleed, and no one knew how to stop it. As with his predecessors, Diocletian understood that there was something inherently dangerous about making the coins of the empire literally less valuable. Of course, that hadn't stopped his predecessors from going ahead and debasing the coins anyway, but they all sort of grasped that they were playing with fire, which is why debasement went on in secret. Aurelian had finally arrested the free fall and even turned back the tide a bit, and Diocletian hoped to follow his lead and bring the currency of the Roman Empire back into respectability. To this end, he ordered that a new hierarchy of 5 coins begin circulation immediately, based on the old 3-metal system. 2 copper coins and 1 silver-copper mixed coin for everyday transactions. 1 nearly pure silver coin, something which had not been seen in years, for larger purposes, and 1 high-grade gold coin reserved for major payments, those usually coming from or going to the imperial government. One of the side effects of debasement had been that cheap silver coins had pushed the more common copper coins, the dollars and cents used on a daily basis by the population, out of circulation, which threw the whole system completely out of whack. Diocletian hoped that his new hierarchy would return balance to the system, but unfortunately, no dice. See, while there is no denying that the coins Diocletian issued during this period were of far better quality than what had been released over the course of the preceding generation, Diocletian was not practicing monetary policy in a vacuum. Had his new currency system been set up on a blank slate, it probably would have worked great. But the Roman Empire at the end of the 3rd century was anything but a blank slate. There were just millions and millions of bad coins already out there, and given the shortage of precious metals and the exacting standards Diocletian was trying to reassert in the mints, his new coins were simply unable to make a big enough impact to really curb inflation. Plus, the Romans didn't really understand the root of the problem, and so they missed what is today obvious to us. It is not necessarily the intrinsic value of the coin that is important to setting prices. It is rather the number of coins in circulation. Complete dummies. They understood the basics of scarcity and abundance. After all, they lived and died each year with crop failures and bumper harvests driving the prices of grain all over the map. But they never made the leap to understanding that the same laws affect currency. To the Romans, currency was a stable element. A coin was worth exactly what it was worth, whether there were 500 in circulation or 5 million. And the thing is, for the most part, that had been true in their experience. The price of goods and the wages of workers and soldiers changed very little over the centuries.